Hey guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So, we're on our very last topic now within our thematic question of social policies and how far Hitler was able to create his Volksgemeinschaft, how far he was able to get people on side and to be part of his united German Reich. Now, the last topic is the church. I've split this into two videos. The first one, I'm going to go through kind of a short introduction and Protestant church. And the second one, I'm going to look at the Catholic Church and then a short conclusion and summary. Now, remember, we have previously looked at the church already once before when we looked at church resistance to the terror state. So if you haven't watched that or you need reminding, go and check that out. This will give a little bit of overlapping information, but it will mostly give a far more depth than we previously looked at in terms of the role of the church within German society, how important it was, and where it posed difficulty to Hitler when creating a Volksgemeinschaft. Now, the Christian faith and the Nazi regime should have been polar opposites to each other. One advocates love and cooperation, the other hate and struggle. However, they shared many common outlooks. Both respected traditional cultural values such as the family, and both of them, typically hated communism. There was also a strong sense of nationalism and respect for the state, particularly in the Protestant religion, as well as anti-Semitism from both Protestants and Catholics. Now, it's clear that the church could have posed a barrier to Hitler's successful Volk and could block committed loyalty to the regime. As a skilled politician, Hitler realized he could not immediately embark on his ambition to remove the church entirely. So he first tried to control the church before then trying to weaken the church and finally trying to replace the church in Germany. He wanted to work with the church, outwardly supporting the church, and then gradually reduce its influence. If you think for a second about the nature, the very nature of religion, by definition, you owe your ultimate loyalty and belief to somebody, either your God or whoever it may be. And that was very, very problematic to Hitler. He wanted to fulfill that role. He wanted to be that person that people owed ultimate loyalty to, him and the state. Now, the church, therefore, obviously presented a difficulty. Coordinating the churches into the Volk also provided a serious challenge for the Nazi regime. The first problem being that Germans were divided by faith. Now, I'm just going to run through for a second the demographic and some figures about the Protestant church in Germany. So there were over 40 million members of the Protestant church. This was about 58% of the population. Traditionally nationalist and supported conservative parties during the Weimar Republic. However, they were more divided than the Catholic churches. We had Lutheran and Calvinist branches. They were organized into 28 state-based churches, and youth organizations had around 0.7 million members. Now, the majority of Germans were Protestant, but there was a very significant majority who were Roman Catholic, which you can tell from the figures. Secondly, by nature of its role as a century-old set of beliefs and system of loyalty, it's hard to make the Führer the focus of loyalty for all Germans. Hitler approached the churches cautiously at first to gain control, with the later aim of weakening this influence. Now, there's also no coherent view or policy on religion. Hitler had been raised Catholic and talked of positive Christianity, but then sometimes also stated how he wanted to completely eradicate Christianity from Germany. He was clearly hostile to the Christian faith. However, in the early months was very, very careful not to alienate the church. Other Nazis like Robert Ley were atheists who wanted to replace the church entirely and replace it with a new Nazi religion. So there are different churches, there are different approaches. This sets up a situation that's likely to be fraught with a lack of coherence. As I said, I'm going to go through the Protestant church today. So the main church in Germany was the German Evangelical Church. This was seen by many as a potential nucleus for a single national church. Evangelicals were very conservative and strong nationalists, and the Protestant church had a strong tradition of respect and cooperation with the state. Many Protestants in Germany were anti-Semitic and anti-communist. Therefore, there were lots of points of convergence between the Nazi ideology and the views of German Protestants. Now, the first body I'm going to speak about is the Reich Church. Now, from July 1933, the SA were ordered to attend church ceremonies, showing the idea that Hitler initially kind of flirted with the idea of the importance of the church. By the summer of 1933, the Nazi regime began to coordinate the evangelical church into a single centralized Reich Church. This was under Nazi control. Within the church elections, Goebbels aided the German Christians with propaganda, and they won a sweeping victory, bringing the church to a position where it could be Nazified. The German Christians were a pressure group of Nazis operating within the German evangelical church. They wanted to restructure the whole of Protestantism into a new racially based brand of Christianity. By the mid 1930s, they had around 600,000 supporters and described themselves as the SA of the church. So they are Christians, they still want to follow Christianity, but they are also Nazis, and they are trying to Nazify the church from within, okay? Now, they had a lot of support, as I previously said. And in addition to that, in August of 1933, 2/3 of those attending a Prussian synod, which is an assembly of Protestant pastors, showed their allegiance to the German Christians by wearing Nazi uniforms. German Christians, pastors wore SA or SS uniforms, hung swastikas in their churches, and their slogan was "the swastika on our breasts, the cross in our hearts." Now, a man called Ludwig Müller was appointed a Protestant pastor. A man called Ludwig Müller was a Protestant pastor associated with the Nazis since the 1920s. He was appointed Reich Bishop. He took over the administrative headquarters of the Reich Church with the help of the SA. Now, Müller abolished all elected bodies within the church and reorganized it on the leadership principle, the same one that Hitler used. In November 1933, the German Christians celebrated their triumph in taking over the Reich Church with a mass rally at the Sports Palace in Berlin. So you can see the fact they're aligning themselves with the Nazi Party, with Nazi ideas, the use of parades, etc. They demanded the dismissal of pastors who had not declared their allegiance to the new regime, along with non-Aryans. The Reich Church was also forced to adopt the Aryan paragraph. Remember, that's where anyone who converted to Christianity, so those who were Jewish who had converted to Christianity, are forced to resign. And 18 pastors who had converted to Christianity from Judaism were dismissed. It appeared by the end of 1933 that the Reich Church had been successfully coordinated into the Volk. Now, we have another group of people called the German Faith Movement, and they went even further than the Reich Church and the German Christians. They wanted to Nazify Christianity. The faith movement wanted to replace it entirely with a new pagan Nazi faith. It encouraged Germans to leave Christianity and adopt pagan rituals. For example, the SS held marriages in runic carved rooms. It remained a small sect, but demonstrates what the Nazis could have done if they had won the war. Okay, so not everyone is prepared to support the Nazified Reich Church, and in September of 1933, a group of dissident pastors led by Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer established the Pastors Emergency League. This evolved into the Confessional Church, which gained the support of around 5,000 pastors. The Confessional Church was established to resist state intervention in the church and to re-establish a theology based on the Bible. It was therefore in opposition with the Reich Church and Nazi aims. The very fact it was established shows the Nazi church was a failure. It shows failure of Gleichschaltung, and just the very fact that this existed as opposition shows that they have not been able to unify the church and bring them on side. In the face of growing public outcry in support of the Confessional Church, Hitler distanced himself from Bishop Müller, and in 1935, a new ministry for church affairs was established, with Reich Bishop Müller being marginalized. Okay, now this marks a turning point. No longer was the Nazi regime trying to control the Protestant church, but it was now trying to weaken it. Clearly, it hasn't worked. So Hitler moves on. Okay, he's not going to try and work with them anymore. He's not going to try and dominate and control. He's just going to try and weaken it. Now, it managed to marginalize Christianity by trying to reduce the influence of churches over young people through the abolition of church schools in the late 1930s and pressure on young people to join the Hitler Youth. They also launched a church succession campaign to persuade party members to renounce their church membership. So the attempt to unify the church had failed. Instead, we have three dominant branches of the Protestant faith: the Confessional Church, those who separated themselves from the Nazis; the German Christians, Christian Nazis working from within the church to try and dominate it; and the Reich Church, the German unified church that wasn't. And these are the really important three main things you have to remember when we think of the Protestant church. Now, was there success? So I'm just going to go through a couple of pieces of evidence now that you can use to show, you can use to evaluate the extent to which there was success. So by 1939, 5% of the population were listed as God believers, which is not very many. Party members were not allowed to hold any office in the Protestant or Catholic Church, and likewise, priests and pastors were forbidden in the Nazi Party. So you can see the fact they're separating themselves from the church entirely. There was a pressure on public servants, teachers, civil servants in particular, to renounce their faith, particularly those whose employment depended on the state or the regime. And 800 out of 17,000 Protestant pastors were arrested. However, only 50 received prison sentences. So I think what's obvious here is that actually the number of those who resisted or caused any kind of complaint or problem large enough to be arrested or imprisoned was actually relatively small. 800 out of 17,000 and only 50 deemed dangerous enough to imprison. You know, while the heroism, the bravery of those individuals cannot be undermined, once I finish the Catholic video, I'm going to really summarize this properly, but it does seem like the church is not presenting a huge element of resistance against, the Volk and being brought into the Volksgemeinschaft.